Hello, my name is Jacob Icolari, and welcome to my TED Talk. For this project, throughout the course of this general class, I have chosen to pay close attention to Chapter 7, which is mainly on mental illnesses and mental health disorders, and suicide. The reason I chose Chapter 7 and, to talk about suicide and mental health disorders was because I have a very close and unwanted connection to it. A lot of what one would assume would be to discuss something that is very broad, very easily able to, dissect, dissolve, and explain. The reason I chose to do the majority of my project on suicide is because that is one of the things that, regardless of the situation at hand, regardless of who it is, when it is, where it occurs, there's never ever going to be an answer or an understanding by those who were not inside the individual who decided to take their lives. So without further ado, I'm here to explain suicide and how mental health disorders typically fully play an excruciating role in the individuals who decide to do it. I started off my presentation with talking about the causes of suicide. Obviously I mentioned mental disorders, the specific types. I mentioned, the specific type of people or the typical type of people that most researchers, psychologists, and doctors find it to be most common. I also discussed, essential preventative measures or ways in which we as a society nowadays go about trying to fix and prevent not only mental disorders, but suicide as a whole. One of the things that throughout the research that I've conducted, whether it's reading my textbook or talking to people outside on the street, or even referring back to my sister, who is the reason why I chose to do mental health disorders and suicide, because she herself suffers from both and has suffered from both. She's not dead, thankfully, but still, this was something that hit very home for me. And the biggest thing that I found to be the case was there usually is no single individual reason why one decides to try to take their life or one decides to take their life. And that those several factors that I mentioned can increase the risk of suicide, such as mental disorders, and genetics even is what we found to be, a minor situation, a minor piece of the puzzle, but still plays a role. The environment that an individual finds themselves in, and things of that nature. So to talk about a few of the mental disorders that I found to be the most interesting is, obviously, in many cases, thoughts of suicide are caused by an underlying health disorder, such as depression, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder. Those three are the most common and most easily diagnosed throughout, the world, and the most popular throughout the world. And, when it comes to when you think of mental health, you think of someone who might be depressed, someone who might hear voices in their head, schizophrenia, someone who is, up and down emotionally, and bipolar disorder. It is very interesting to me to understand depression. Hundreds of millions of people are affected around the world. And that being the case, from what researchers and psychologists have found, is the leading reason for most suicide. It, being depressed is a feeling of being lost, being hopeless, usually, stems from pain, stems from, life experiences that necessarily haven't, played positive roles in one's life. There are a lot of biological factors that really play a role. One of the things is, the main thing that most doctors can pinpoint is the idea that one's brain is not able to function properly due to the decreased levels of serotonin and norepinephrine. Those essentially are the brain's way of processing information, processing feeling, emotion, happiness. It's what fuels people to be active and be just general people. Obviously everybody has their individualities, but those two, I guess you could say, I like to call them happy juice. Those two things are what fuel the brain to be able to function properly, along with obviously many other things. Depression has been found most commonly in people starting at the age of 16 to 30, starting. Being that this is such a common mental health disorder, there have not been a specific age range that doctors or psychologists or researchers in general have been able to kind of sort out and understand that depression affects the most. Depression, depression is, from what I understand, after asking people who have suffered from it, is just the sense of feeling like you are just 700 pounds of grief, of, disdain, of sadness, anger, frustration, anything that you feel that is not happiness, irritability, and essentially you are unable to shake it. It is something that no matter what you do, even if you remember your favorite pastimes or take part in your favorite activities, you're unable to just simply find any, get up to do anything other than feel that way. A lot of people are unable to explain, come to terms, or really understand why they feel that way. This mental health disorder eventually ends up leading to, like I said earlier, that feeling of hopelessness, that feeling of the best way to get rid of this feeling and not feel like this anymore, not feel this pain, this frustration, this anger, this undying need to just not be happy. It ends up resulting in an individual committing suicide, or at least attempting. Another mental disorder that I spoke about in my project, schizophrenia. Those who don't really necessarily know, because it's uncertain as to what causes schizophrenia. People have looked into it being, a family matter or biological or something that, someone inherits or, it is so up in the air what this disease really is, other than the fact that people who feel this disease have this constant knowledge of just hearing several voices in their head. And not just necessarily hearing the voices in their head, but really having these voices cause them to feel essentially like they're being attacked. They're always sort of on edge. They're, they have, basically this disease affects the way people think, feel, and behave. I unfortunately, when doing this research, went out in public, and the most common people you find who might experience these sorts of behaviors are those who are homeless. I found a guy who seemingly was walking around the street just talking to himself, and I was terrified, but I asked him a question and he was unable to respond. Now, obviously, I'm not a doctor, but I can't assume that that's what he had. But from my information that I have and from the research I've done, this checks all the boxes. This man was unable to have a conversation. This man was completely delirious, had hallucinations, and essentially felt like I was a danger to him. Was running around and cursing his mind out and yelling help and just it was terrifying. But the connection to suicide is the fact that these voices that people hear in their heads become so overwhelming and at times to where they just want it to stop. Similarly to depression, they are unable to escape it. They are unable to define it and understand why they are feeling this way, why they have these voices in their head. And it really makes it so that they're crazy. And it just, for them, they don't want to feel it. They want it to stop. So that then leads to depression. And then the depression then leads to suicidal thoughts. And then suicidal thoughts then lead to suicidal actions. The third and final mental health disorder that I touched on in my project was bipolar disorder. Another excruciatingly common disorder, but not necessarily a disorder that relates directly to suicide, but more suicide attempts and cries for help. Bipolar disorder is the feeling of up and down emotionally. One day you're happy and on top of the world, the next you're at your absolute lowest and don't know what's going on, and then you're in between, and it just doesn't, there's not a subtle or a consistent flux of just emotion that one is feeling. The unfortunate part about bipolar disorder is the aspect of it is just not fully understood yet. We don't necessarily know if it is genetics or if it's the environment, but most psychologists and most of the resources that I had used from Google Scholar have all found that those two pieces, genetics and environment, play some role. Not a full role, but some role. Bipolar disorder is most commonly, also has a common name of, manic depression. Where people suffer manic episodes, causing unusual shifts in mood, energy, and activity. Like I said earlier, again, one of the common themes that this whole project is meant to do is that there is just a web. Throughout these mental disorders, they all are connected to one another at some juncture. Suicide being, if you look at my hand and see suicide here, depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, bipolar disorder, PTSD, all of these have connective qualities and traits to one another that eventually lead to the action of suicide. Bipolar disorder is classified and has many classifications, but the two most common are bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Bipolar 1 is the most common, where it is known as manic depressive disorder, where the individual has at least one full manic episode in his or her life. Bipolar 2, the less common form of bipolar disorder, is when the person has depressive episodes and less severe forms of mania, better known as hypomania, that don't necessarily have them feeling as extreme as bipolar 1 disorder. Essentially, one of the things that we can understand about mental health disorders is that, and suicide, is that they are going to be connected until we find a cure or a treatment. The unfortunate part about that is we have yet to find a treatment, and it doesn't look from what researchers and doctors and psychologists are saying that there will ever be a treatment, because there's no way, or as of now, there has been no way that we can just go into the brain, scramble some things up, and have it just disappear at the snap of our fingers. As much as I'm sure the majority of people would love to have that happen, it's just unrealistic. To finish off my video, my TED Talk, I want to kind of make sure that this gets out there, that we seem to think that we do a good job at providing help and resources for mental health patients and suicide patients, and essentially there's nothing we can do. We don't know, they don't know, and that's the toughest part about it. So the most important thing and the most repetitive thing that I found throughout the course of my research that psychologists, doctors, and researchers have consistently said was to pay attention to the signs, was to pay attention to the words, was to pay attention to the actions of those who might be feeling a different or certain way, and to immediately find and seek help. I appreciate the chance to be a part of your course this semester, and I look forward to potentially taking another one. Thank you, doctor.